does Revelation, do you see it only as a historical book that we just kind of, what's your view on how that, what does Revelation have to do with us today?
Yeah.
And after we talk about that, I actually want to ask you about another, at least in popular literature, about the mark of the beast and maybe even the beast himself. But what's your take on how the book of Revelation, when you're doing this and you're writing about it in the commentary, where's your heart at in terms of what does this mean to the church today?
It's very applicable today, but it has to be applied in the right way, of course. Often, introductions to Revelation will summarize 4 major approaches. The idealist approach, it says it deals with timeless principles, but they're not really anchored in any particular time. That's when it's taken to its complete conclusion. The historicist approach, which basically makes it a reading of church history that has to be updated every few years as history goes on longer than expected. That it was more popular in the 19th century than it is today. But another approach is the preterist approach. It says, okay, this was all not just relevant to the first century, but this happened in the first century. That's there are different levels of preterism. The most extreme preterists, I talked with one who said that the resurrection of the dead has already passed.
Yeah.
And I said, that Paul calls that heretical, right? He says, well, yeah, but anyway. That's the extreme preterist. The other preterists consider that heretical. But, and then the futurist approach that says, no, it's all future. No, most people hold at least somewhat of a mixture of these.
Yeah.
Because
I would think that's true, just from pastors I know. And I would say myself, that's where I would fit, kind of in all of those.
Revelation 12, when the child is caught up to heaven to rule the nations with the rod of iron, almost everybody agrees that that's Jesus, and that already happened.
Right.
So at least that much is past. And in terms of the symbols that are used in Revelation, a lot of them are symbols that were widespread in that day. They were things that would be intelligible to readers in that day, as preterists would say. And then,
well, there's no doubt that the churches were real churches,
exactly.
and they were speaking to real situations that did unfold in their day. That doesn't mean necessarily that there's no or that God did not want it to be applied.
Right.
Otherwise, there would be no reason to record it.
When Paul writes letters to Philippi or Corinth, we don't allegorize those churches.
Right. Yeah, that's right.
And these are letters to the 7 churches in Revelation. But then also, almost everybody agrees that Revelation 21 and 22, whatever they think about 20, they think Revelation 21 and 22 is future. So most people have at least some futurism and at least some past. And in terms of the ideal principles, all Scripture is inspired and is profitable for teaching. Yeah. So, there have to be principles there. There has to be a message there that still speaks to us today. But what we normally do with other parts of the Bible, we read them in their historical context. Sometimes like case studies, we say, okay, this is what it said to them in their situation. Well, that has a lot to do for our situations today. Just take into account the different situations.
Yeah.
In the case of Revelation, some people, they want to say, no, it's all future or almost all future because some of these things haven't happened yet because you can't interpret things symbolically. Well, there are different genres in the Bible. Yeah. Some things you interpret pretty literally, and some things you interpret a lot more figuratively. For example, in Hebrew poetry, when Job says, my steps are bathed in butter, or in the Song of Solomon, where the bride, I believe it is, her eyes are the pools of Heshbon. Are they literally pools of Heshbon? She sits up and her eyes just drip right out of her head. Your neck is like the tower of,
Well, does the harlot actually sit on 7 mountains?
Right. In Revelation.
Yeah.
She's the mother mother of prostitutes. So you meet a prostitute, you say, "Oh, I read about your mom." Or in Revelation 12, the woman clothed with the sun.
Yeah.
On average, we're like 93 million miles from the sun, but this woman is clothed with the sun. I mean, that's pretty warm.
Yeah.
And Revelation even says, Revelation chapter 1 and verse 20, it interprets some of the symbols. It says the stars are the angels of the seven churches, the lampstands are the seven churches, lampstands being the standard symbol for Jewish congregations throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. The Star of David comes a lot later. And so you have things that are specifically understood as symbols within the book of Revelation. And then Revelation also, even verse 1, where it says that God sent and signified this message. The word signified, semino, is a cognate of the word semeion, sign, which is used for the woman in heaven, the great red dragon in heaven. These were signs, they were symbols. And God was communicating the book partly in symbols. Because the tradition of Hebrew prophecy, most of the writing prophets prophesied in poetry before the exile. After the exile, that wasn't necessarily the case, but they still used a lot of symbolism. And look at Zechariah.
Yeah.
Clearly a lot of symbolism. And so that's not to say that everything has to be symbolic, but we need to interpret Revelation on its own terms, not with a pre-existing, well, everything has to be literal. That's not the way you were supposed to interpret that kind of literature. And you can compare other kinds of works that were composed, like First Enoch, 2nd century BC, not really written by Enoch by any means, but it talks about these stars falling from heaven and impregnating these cows. Now, you read it in context in First Enoch, it's talking about the sons of God going into the daughters of men, but it's put in symbolic language. So by the time you get to the book of Revelation, people were used to, not just in the Old Testament, but even in other documents that were circulating, they were used to the idea of, sometimes these things are communicated in symbolic language. As to what the symbolic language means, a lot of the symbols are taken directly from the Old Testament.
Right, yeah.
And some of them are taken directly from first century Greco-Roman world. We sometimes want to read, we do what I call newspaper hermeneutics.
Yeah.
Where prophecy teachers will keep revising their interpretation of passages as the newspaper headlines change. So, for example, the kings of the East in Revelation 16, until World War I, the Western interpreters of that in Europe and, Western Europe and in North America, interpreted that as the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Now, to the seven churches in Asia Minor, would they think of Turkey as East? But the Turkish Ottoman Empire, that was the threat as far as these Western interpreters were concerned. Yeah. After World War I, when that empire was dismembered, the threat on the horizon now from the East, they said this refers to Imperial Japan. Well, after World War II, and the U.S. and Japan are friends, they say no, it refers to Communist China, the great red dragon, of course. But if you actually look at what it says in
Russia.
Revelation,
Yeah. It's been across the board.
After the U.S. becomes friends with China, they start interpreting it that way. The river Euphrates, across which the kings of the East travel, was the boundary between the Roman and Parthian empires. And the Parthians were the most feared enemies of the Romans. So, using the language of its day, it's speaking of a terribly fierce invasion, the worst conceivable invasion. Now, if you were reading first century newspapers instead of modern newspapers, to see what the imagery comes from, well, in just maybe 5 or 10 years, before Revelation was written, the Parthians actually did cross the river Euphrates, invaded Asia Minor, where these 7 churches were, and claimed that Nero, who had died in Rome, but had been a persecutor of the Christians. Nero was at the head. They thought it wasn't the real Nero, but a fake Nero was at the head of this invasion, and it was repelled. But this was something that would be present in people's minds and hearts. Not saying, let's expect literal Parthians to come back and cross the river Euphrates, or people saying these are helicopters or something. You have.
I remember one time one popular prophecy preacher was talking about the buildup of horses. The Soviet Union, they were going to use horses to invade and things like that. Yeah, that happens quite often, doesn't it?
Well, and when people apply it and say, I think it was Hal Lindsey, these are Apache attack helicopters. That's not what the symbol meant. But if it were written in our day, that might be the symbol that would be used for an invasion. So I don't think he was interpreting right, but I think he got, he translated some of the images into scary kind of images that really communicate the point. You better be right with God.
Yeah.
You better repent if you're not right with God, because things are going to get worse. This tendency to misinterpret Revelation or set dates, worst of all, it's been going on for a long time. Hippolytus said the world would end by the year 500. Of course,
I didn't know that.
Was off a little bit.
Yeah.
One of the other early church fathers, Saint Martin of Tours, said that the Antichrist had surely already been born. Martin died in 397. So if he was right, the Antichrist is very old. But of course, 1 John 2:18, you've heard an Antichrist is coming. Even now there are many Antichrists.
Yeah, anyone who denies that Jesus Christ is coming. Yeah.
But you look through history, and there's all, it's been going on during the Reformation period. Somebody was saying, okay, Strasbourg is going to become the New Jerusalem, and he died in prison there 10 years later. Somebody else was saying that the peasant revolt is going to precipitate the end of the age.
Yeah.
And it did for him. Thousands of peasants were killed. He was taken prisoner and executed. Back then, in time, speculations died hard, sometimes literally. And you have this continuing in subsequent centuries.
I'm not familiar with a lot of those. I do know, like at 1000 AD, a lot of people thought that the end was coming, and of course that corresponded with 2000 AD, and in the eve of 1900, there were a bunch of people who took out newspaper ads saying, the world's going to end at the turn of the century. You better get right with God. Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So it's been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
Y2K, for anybody who remembers that in 2000. But one of the big ones was 1988. They said, 40 years after 1948 is going to be it, based on a complete misinterpretation of the passage.
Right.
But in 1987, it was 1988. There was a book called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Might Be in 1988.
Yeah.
And that book sold 3 million copies. I had a friend who worked in a Christian bookstore then, and the owner told her, make sure to sell as many copies of that as you can before December 31st, because in 1989, nobody's going to buy the book. And sure enough, in 1989, the same author wrote a revised edition, 89 Reasons Why Jesus Might Come Back in 1989.
Yeah. And
for some reason, it didn't sell very well. Let it never be said that North American Christians are easily deceived 2 years in a row by the same person. The one thing that predictors of times and seasons have all had in common is they've always been wrong.
Yeah.
So let's just stop with that stuff. But hear the message of Revelation. It teaches us about prayer moving history. The prayers of the saints move history in the book. It teaches us about God's judgment, that God is just, and that He doesn't look the other way in a world of evil, but He brings everybody down to the same level before Him. We read about God's promises to us of victory and hope.
It is a revelation of Jesus Christ, right? I mean,
and Jesus is worth dying for.
Yeah.
And you see that all the way through the book of Revelation. And the letters of the seven churches are so applicable.
So with the mark of the beast, that scares people today. I mean, I remember growing up as a kid. But by the way, I remember in 1980, we had one of our top in our camp meeting up in Michigan. We had one of our top evangelists come to camp meeting. Scared the daylights out of me. I almost didn't go to college. I mean, it was like, we have 1,000 days, and it was a whole, and everything. And of course, that 1,000 days has come and went. But